Bloomberg Audio Studios. Podcasts, radio, news.
Welcome to Bloomberg UK Politics, your bite-sized guide to the corridors of power. I'm James Woolcock.
And I'm Yuan. Welcome to the programme. So a big drop in the headline rate of inflation. Consumer prices are now just 2.3% higher than they were a year ago. That's a big drop from the previous month. But that was mostly down to lower household energy bills. Very welcome for households. But the total drop was less than economists were expecting. And worse than that, once you strip out volatile food and energy costs, core inflation also disappointed, falling more slowly than forecast.
Now, you can tell we are nearing an election. Both parties were up bright and early this morning, pushing their narrative of how we should be looking at this inflation data. For the government, the Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, said the news is evidence that his administration's actions are working.
Inflation is back to normal, and that is an important moment for our country, for the economy, and shows that our plan is working. Now, whilst I know people are only just starting to feel the benefits and there is more work to do, I hope this gives people confidence that if we stick to the plan, there are brighter days ahead.
And you can tell the government really wants to make a message out of this, because not just has Rishi Sunak been out on the broadcast rounds, you had Chancellor Jeremy Hunt has also been busy touting the benefits of falling inflation in terms of a reduced cost of living.
Yeah, and James, I think interesting to look at what this means for when the Bank of England will start to cut interest rates. Traders have been pushing back their bets for when that might happen. And that's all to do with the gap between the expected figures and the actual data. Now, 0.2%, that's the gap between those two things. Might not sound like a big difference, but it has prompted a big reaction from the market.
I mean, there's three schools of thought here, aren't there, Ewan? Because you've got the Conservatives pointing to one of the sharpest falls in headline CPI in sort of the past half a century, over 18 months, which is a real achievement. On the other hand, you've got, as you point out, the markets who look at the very high service inflation and how that pushes back the Bank of England's potential rate path, and that will have knock-on effects at mortgages. And then you have Labour, who are saying, whoa, we can't forget about the sort of real wages hit that has happened over the past 2 years. You've got Rachel Reeves, the Shadow Chancellor, saying this morning, families are worse off, making reference to those mortgage bills and taxes at a 70-year high.
The government are now on a sort of victory lap for that. But inflation is still not back at the Bank of England target. But crucially, and this is why I think Securenomics is so important, the government have done very little to address the underlying reasons for why inflation got out of control in the first place. And that's why Securenomics is so important, so that we build in that resilience. So when shocks come along, as they inevitably will, we are not so exposed in the way that we found ourselves these last few years.
Yeah, she's been out touting Labour's Securenomics policy, very much on message as usual, saying that Labour will, quote, grow our economy, keep taxes, inflation and mortgages as low as possible. But will it be enough? If Labour do win the next general election, they'll need to balance lowering the cost of living and keeping markets and business on side. That's something we've seen loads of from the shadow front bench over the last year or so, courting business with their scrambled egg offensives and some other fancy soirees, none of which I've been invited to.
Speak for yourself. What is the real story here, though, Ewan? And I think we're going to be talking to our UK chief economist, Dan Hanson, shortly to figure out quite which bits of this kind of data point should we be paying attention to, and with a Prime Minister's questions coming later today where every politician worth their salt is going to try and frame it in their way. It's worth pointing to pollster Patrick English, who we've had on this podcast before from YouGov. He made a point this morning on Twitter saying that the Conservatives are in danger of falling into a trap by telling the public that things are going well, when he says that the majority aren't telling pollsters that they're feeling that way.
Well, let's get into all of this now with Dan Hanson, as you mentioned, James, who is our chief UK economist for Bloomberg Economics. Now, Dan, let's get a bit nerdy. That's what we're all here for, ultimately. We know the headline rate of inflation has dropped, and it's actually pretty near target now, but core inflation and service inflation, they're not looking so pretty, are they?
No, that's right. I mean, I think this is sort of, if you look at it, just stepping back, headline inflation's dropped to 2.3%. Back at the end of 2022, we were in double digits. So we've come an awful long way, and we've got close to 2% much, much quicker than anyone had expected. Sort of at the turn of the year, or just before the turn of the year, I should say, everyone was thinking we wouldn't get back to 2% until maybe 2025. So we've sort of brought that forward a year. That's obviously sort of big picture good news. But obviously, as you mentioned there, we like to get nerdy with these things, and it's what's happened relative to everyone's expectations, and it didn't fall in April, the latest figure didn't fall quite as much as everyone's expectation. So we got a 2.3% figure. The expectation was for 2.1. Some people are a little bit below that as well. So that's what's been driving the market reaction. And as you've both sort of spoken about there, it's particularly this point about services prices. Now, the reason markets and the Bank of England get animated about services prices is because they are more closely correlated than other bits of the inflation basket to what goes on in the domestic economy. So, and therefore mostly driven by what goes on in the labour market. And that essentially gives the Bank of England a signal about how sustainable this return to 2% or return close to 2% is. And at the moment, services inflation is running at twice its, a little bit below now, but about twice its long run average. So that isn't, if you're sitting in Threadneedle Street thinking about interest rates, that isn't a good news story. And that's why we've seen the market reaction today. We've seen traders really pare back on their expectations for Bank of England rate cuts. And it's really driven by the services number. They were expecting a bigger fall in services inflation, the Bank of England, and it hasn't materialised.
Are we kind of stuck at a turning point here, Dan? Because you look at inflation as obviously doesn't yet feed through into prices. You said wage data hasn't yet caught up. So on one hand, things will get better in the sort of medium to long-term future. But for the moment, as well as that kind of core inflation reading you point out is also likely to keep mortgage rates a lot higher than maybe they could be. So when the Bank of England starts cutting potentially a few months down the line. And we kind of weirdly, actually, rather than being, say, a good news day, sort of pointing out that we're now at the inflection point and we could be for a few months yet.
I mean, I think if you look at the way inflation behaved on the way up, it was that things like energy prices, food prices, and a broader set of goods prices pushed up headline inflation. What happened is that in the context of a very tight labour market that we had, workers saw higher inflation and they bargained for higher wages. And that obviously had what monetary policy makers call second round effect. So that then fed into services inflation because it's mainly driven by wages. There are other components too, but it's mainly driven by wages. And so services inflation is this thing that sort of reacts last, if you like. So to go to your point, which is a really important one, and it's the thing that the Bank of England will be grappling with. It's this balance between being data dependent and placing some weight on for what we've seen today and other data points as well, but also deciding, I should say, how much faith they want to have in the idea that the process that pushed inflation high will eventually reverse. And the reason they have forecasts and the reason they are meant to be forward-looking is because monetary policy works with a lag. Obviously, we're operating in a world of extreme uncertainty, and that's we all know that. But ultimately, they can't wait too long because they risk an undershoot of inflation. I think with the economy holding up, the data we've had today, time is on their side, but it's sort of not infinite, if you like. We're at a policy stance that is restrictive. It is weighing on the economy and crimping demand. And at some point, they're going to have to take some of that away if they don't want to generate a massive undershoot of inflation further down the line. Dan, I know you're UK economist. To put this in a bit of context for us looking more widely at the European picture, the government were very keen to blame global factors for the rise of inflation, and now it's coming down. They're keen to take the credit, unsurprisingly. But this is a global situation, isn't it? How do we compare with the rest of the continent? Absolutely is. So it's energy prices, it's food prices, and I share the sort of sentiment of Andrew Bailey, which is that the UK's inflation problem is probably closer to Europe's than it is the US's. The US's is very much a sort of overheating economy, demand-driven inflation problem. In the UK and in Europe, a lot of it has been to do with, as I sort of said to James there, energy, food, and the like, and that has had spillover effects into the wider sort of price-setting behaviour within the economy. But you're absolutely right. The reason why inflation is coming down is because of a set of external factors now. So it's falling energy prices, food inflation's easing, what we call core goods inflation, which is a sort of bit of the basket that was originally impacted by the supply constraints that hit the economy as everything reopened following COVID. Those things are behaving and coming down as everyone's expecting. It's just this services bit of the basket that isn't behaving as everyone expects. But I think to answer your question, if you were going to make a comparison, I think we're much more like Europe, the rest of Europe, than we are the US. At least that's the way it looks at the moment.
Now, the Westminster rumour mill is running at full speed today, saying that maybe Rishi Sunak could call an election on the back of these figures. And frankly, I think it should be taken with sort of a lot of scepticism, because part of the problem with not calling an election when we know one has to come from January is you see a positive headline for the government, you think maybe today is the day. But not to ask you about that, Dan, if you were the Prime Minister and you were thinking about fighting an election on the economy, is the UK economy in a good state right now? Does Labour's attack line of people don't feel better really stick?
The differentiation you have to make is between levels, and this is Labour's argument, that the price level is 20% higher, has risen by 20% over recent years because of this surge in inflation. So that's people feeling poorer. The government's argument is that the rate of change, so that's inflation, the change in prices, is coming back to more normal levels. And they're the two different arguments that they're making. If you're asking me as Prime Minister, I think, were I the Prime Minister right now, you've got some relatively favourable data, I would say. You've got 2.3% inflation, nearly at target. You've got the economy that's bounced back pretty sharply from the recession, sharper than almost everyone expected. But as I say, they're all sort of one-off. They're changes. They are to do with 1 month or 1 quarter. The point Labour is making is that it's what's happened over a very long period of time to prices and people's real incomes, essentially. And that's where the sort of two lines of argument are going to play out in the election, and that's where it's going to be fought at least when it comes to the economy.
Dan, the decent or the improving economic data that you mentioned so far has had absolutely no impact on the Tories' economic competence ratings. If you were the government, sitting there looking at trying to get the poll numbers up, don't look back at the 1992 Parliament, of course, when the economy went well and nobody gave them any credit whatsoever. I think the other part of this picture is the labour market, isn't it? How do you think that people are feeling in terms of the jobs market? Because it has been robust, hasn't it? But there's signs that it is weakening.
That's probably the big concern, I think. If you were the government and looking at across all the data, things have turned when it comes to, as we've just mentioned there, inflation, GDP. The labour market, it is still tight, and there's no doubt about that. But relative to where we've come from, it's not as tight as it was, and there are signs in the surveys and the like that things could loosen up a little bit more. So by loosen up, I mean the unemployment rate could rise a little bit further. So I think is a risk. Though one thing I've learnt in this job and over the years is never to underestimate the strength of the UK labour market. And it's sort of over the past if you look at the Tories' record from 2010, the labour market is the one thing where once unemployment started to fall, it has remained extremely low. And of course we had you can't say anything other than the success of the furlough scheme during the pandemic. So the labour market is a really big success story. And I think there's a bit of an element of people getting used to the fact that we just have 4% unemployment.
It's funny you mentioned it, Dan, because I have already been seeing that furlough scheme coming up in Conservative campaign things as one of the big successes of this administration. That's our chief UK economist, Dan Hanson. Thank you very much for joining us on the podcast.
Well, that's it for today. If you like the programme, don't forget to subscribe and give it 5 stars so that other people can find it on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen.
This episode was produced by Tiwa Adebayo and our audio engineer was Sean Glastonmakia. I'm James Woolcock.
And I'm Yuan Potts. We'll be back with more tomorrow. This is Bloomberg.
Bloomberg UK Politics. Listen weekdays at noon on DAB Digital Radio in London.